So a little while ago, a show called Seeking Persephone came out, and I got so many comments of people talking about it, asking if I'd seen it, recommending it to other people on the channel, and it's finally kind of on my radar. And I'm just gonna be honest with you guys, I was not the perfect audience for Seeking Persephone, and I knew that going in. But the conversation around this show is, to me, way more interesting than whether or not I was personally obsessed with it. So let's get into it. Welcome back to Regency Rumors. I'm Kayla, and here on my channel, I talk about period dramas, history, and historical fiction. And today we're talking about Seeking Persephone. But really, we're talking about something bigger than that. We're talking about crowdfunded media, why I think it's about to become a much bigger part of what we watch, what this particular production got right, what didn't quite land for me, and why I think how we respond to shows like this matter just as much as the shows themselves. So buckle in. This one is going to be a little bit different. Seeking Persephone is a 4-part limited series based on a novel by Sarah M. Eden, and the story is essentially a Regency-era marriage of convenience rooted in the myth of Persephone and Hades, which, if you know your mythology, already tells you quite a lot about the emotional architecture of what you're walking into. Persephone Lancaster, played by Ryan Bailey, agrees to marry the feared and reclusive Duke of Kildare, Adam Boyce, played by Jake Storman, in a desperate bid to save her family from financial ruin. Maybe it's Jake Stormoyan? Stormoyan? Adam is everything you're expecting from a gothic hero. He's cold, he's distant, and deeply committed to keeping the outside world at an arm's length. But Persephone's determination isn't the usual, feisty heroine trope. It's a quiet, grounded persistence to actually understand the man that she's married. With definite Beauty and the Beast vibes, the series is a slow burn look at whether two people living under the same roof can ever truly bridge the emotional miles between them. Despite this being behind a paywall on Amazon, so you actually have to buy or rent it, it's become a huge success on the platform as the most purchased media in March 2025, which for a small crowd-funded production, that's really remarkable. People have been talking about this series all over TikTok and Instagram. So with all that as the backdrop, let's talk about what I loved and didn't about Seeking Persephone. For those of you who are new here at Regency Rumors, I'm a historian. My PhD research had a focus on landed estates and on telling more well-rounded stories about these big country houses, meaning looking outside the castle walls at the staff and the tenants and the locals and the actual ecosystem of what made these places run. So I come into period dramas like this with a very particular eye. On top of that, I've lived in the UK for almost half of my life at this point. I'm pretty deeply enmeshed in British culture, and I could tell from about 5 minutes in that this show was made for an American audience, which is not a criticism. That's literally who it was made for and funded by. But I'm going to argue later on about how not everything has to be at that BBC period drama level. Don't worry, I'm not a everything has to be historically accurate prude, okay? You guys who've watched the channel for a long time know that period dramas should also be a bit fun. History should be engaging and entertaining and informative on screen. It should not just be stark historical accuracy all the time. If we wanted to watch a documentary, that is what we would watch. So fun and romance and yearning sometimes is appropriate when we're watching our period dramas. So let's talk about what I thought worked really well with this series. I really liked both of the leads together. I thought eventually that they had real chemistry. I loved that the chemistry you could tell that it grew as the series went on. I loved how this was a 100% definite slow burn. I talked about this a lot in my video on the slower pace of The Other Bennett Sister, but slow, intentional, sweet pacing in romances feels increasingly important right now in a world where there's just so much fast-paced media. We're starving for characters who are allowed to develop a real connection over multiple episodes. So Seeking Persephone leaning into that pacing is such a great strength for this series. The show kept pretty close to the book, almost to a T. Audiences right now are absolutely craving faithful adaptations. We've all been a bit traumatized by every adaptation deciding to reimagine the source material into something the author would barely recognize. So I feel like a lot of people were satisfied with this series because of how closely it followed the book. Seeking Persephone showed up and delivered what readers actually wanted, and I'm hopeful that's going to happen more and more with crowdfunded media. Visually, it looked like something that could be on a big network. The filming was well done, the color grading held up, it didn't pull me out of the world. It made me feel like I wanted to be in this cozy Regency era with them. The costuming, okay, look, the costuming is not great. I'm not going to pretend that it is, but it's no different than what we have seen on a bunch of period dramas in the last 5 or 6 years. We are living in the era of slightly suspicious period drama costuming across the board, even on shows with massive budgets. So holding a small crowdfunded production to a higher standard than that feels really unfair. And I feel like the costuming was well done for what this was. And the tailoring on the men's clothing was better than a lot of what I've seen recently in period dramas. I really liked a lot of Persephone's different dresses and her yellow coat. I have a yellow coat that's really similar to that. So overall, I really enjoyed this production. I was also genuinely impressed with the accents in this series. Y'all know this is a pet peeve of mine. There's nothing, and I mean nothing, that takes me out of a period drama faster than a wobbly British accent. The majority of the main actors, from what I can tell, are American, except for some of the staff, and they're all pulling off a generic posh British accent. Y'all know my hot take is we should just end a lot of this accent nonsense anyways and just hire more regional people, but that is not how the business works. So that's why we've got 2 Australians in a Yorkshire-based Wuthering Heights. But I thought all the actors did a great job in this production. Maintaining an accent for an entire production is no small feat, especially when it's not your native one and you're having to do things like shout or talk through crying. I remember going and seeing The Testament of Anne Lee, which I've made a video about, and worrying that Amanda Seyfried couldn't pull off a Mancunian accent. And even though she's gotten a ton of accolades for this film and for her performance, and completely justified, I also feel like it was so distracting that she kept going in and out of the accent, and sometimes it would show up as Australian and other times it would sound like it was Scottish. And so a lot of times that can be really important to maintain an accent when people are having to watch you for like 3 hours. So hats off to the cast of Seeking Persephone for being able to do that for an entire series. The series was supposed to be set in Northumberland, and I liked that it seemed like that they hired actors from probably the Durham, Northumberland area to maintain that authenticity, which is great. This was filmed at Raby Castle, which is in my husband Jordan's hometown, which I loved seeing. I've been to Raby Castle multiple times, and when it popped up on screen, I was like, oh my gosh! The northeast of England has a real disparity in arts and funding access. There's not the same pipeline of opportunity and the same investment as there is down south. So whenever Jordan and I see productions like set up shop in the Northeast and hire local actors and use northern locations as the actual staple of the show and not just as like drone shots, then we genuinely get excited about it because we're like, oh my gosh, like, good on them. I've been to Raby multiple times. It's really one of the most beautiful places. If you ever go to this part of England, please go to Raby Castle. So this does bring me to a much bigger conversation, which is American productions filming in the UK. On the one hand, yes, American companies coming over here, bringing their own crew, taking advantage of UK tax breaks, while public service broadcasters like the BBC are absolutely hemorrhaging. That is a real problem. I have a much more detailed video on the Americanization of British period dramas. I'll link it. Please go watch it if you want a more detailed picture. But the short version is this is part of why we're getting so many American-funded British set shows like Bridgerton and so many fewer of the classic, properly funded BBC adaptations that we grew up on. There's just not the money in the public service broadcasters anymore. And that is genuinely scary for British storytelling. But the kind of money these American productions bring in can sometimes keep the doors open on these historic homes. These places are extraordinarily expensive to maintain. A few weeks of filming fees can mean a roof gets fixed, the heating finally gets sorted, an exhibit gets funded that otherwise just would not come to fruition. And then sometimes that filming leads to tourism. People fly in to visit because they saw it on a show, and that money goes back into the local economy. I want to caveat, I don't actually know the ins and outs of this specific production. I know the production company is Utah-based. I believe most of the actors are Utah-based, and I know it was crowdfunded. So I'm not going to make sweeping claims about who got hired here. In theory, these types of American productions shouldn't infringe upon British ones still being made. But it is a complicated issue. Go watch that video. Times are hard out here, y'all. Seeking Persephone has a Beauty and the Beast dynamic at its core. Two people largely confined to one estate, slowly coming to know and love each other despite a difficult beginning. That's a great romantic premise. It has worked for centuries. We're going to ignore Stockholm Syndrome. On screen, however, in this particular case, I don't think it fully lands the whole time. And I want to explain why, because I think it illuminates something really interesting about how stories in confined spaces actually work. So let's start with Jane Eyre, because Jane Eyre is, at its heart, an isolated in a country house story. Jane arrives at Thornfield Hall as a governess to a small child. Her world for a large portion of that novel is in one estate, with one employer. One increasingly loaded and complicated relationship. But love you, Charlotte. And yet, despite that isolation, you are never just waiting for something to happen, because from the very first week at Thornfield, something is wrong. There's a laugh in the night that nobody explains. There's a fire that starts by itself in a locked room. There's a man who's carrying a terrible secret, and you can feel the weight of it even when he won't tell you what it is. So right away, you're building up to something. You're something is not right. The architecture of Thornfield Hall is a metaphor for Rochester's interior. There are locked rooms, things you're not supposed to see, stories that only come out under pressure. And with that central romance with Jane and Rochester, it's made more powerful by all of that surrounding weight and all the things that you don't know. So we stay hooked. Northanger Abbey is another example, which is interesting because it's intentionally, brilliantly a parody of exactly that convention. Jane Austen is making fun of the Gothic novel. She knows what we're expecting when Catherine Morland arrives at a grand country house with a brooding owner and a history of mysterious deaths. The mystery of Mrs. Tilney's death turns out to be, let's be honest, basically nothing. She died of a perfectly normal illness. Henry's father is unpleasant, but not a murderer. But the novel works, the adaptations work, because even the parody has that architecture of the house castle on a hill also being a bit of a character in the story. The comedy only lands because Austen has genuinely built you a mystery to then pull apart from underneath you. And then with Beauty and the Beast, the version that works, the fairy tale, the animation, two characters fundamentally stuck in one location, and yet it never drags because there is so much of a bigger story underneath the romance that is tied theme-wise to the location. The beast's curse, and how does he break it? The household is alive and can perform and entertain and reveal information to Belle. Belle has other characters to connect with, other corners of the castle to discover. There are things she isn't allowed to see, a mirror that shows her the outside world. and like a library that maybe she didn't know existed. And, there's a ticking clock, and once the last petal falls, it's all over. There's so much that's being built up, even though you're stuck in this one location. All three of these stories take a confined, isolated setting and make it feel enormous because they fill that confinement with mystery, with questions that take time to answer, and that are connected to what the main characters need and want. And that for me is where Seeking Persephone runs into a bit of trouble. I know that she builds a bit of a bond with his friend and his mother. She has some conversations with staff, and there's this like secondary storyline kind of going on about her being afraid of the wolves outside and being afraid of their howling and everything. But other than that, there's not a lot that feels like is keeping us locked in this situation because of the setting that this couple couldn't have gotten together sooner. And I really feel like if you're going to do a story with two characters who are isolated together, and more specifically, one of them is kind of making the other one be stuck there, it makes so much sense to lean into a little bit of the gothicness, in the sense that there's something about the setting and the landscape that's tied to the characters' stories to keep them there, to keep us intrigued. Otherwise, it's a lot of people in the middle of the day talking in drawing rooms. I noticed that the connection between the two leads tended to deepen primarily because something bad happened in the outside world. So someone got hurt or someone died. And that's absolutely a tool you can use. Grief and crisis do bring people together. That is real and human. But if the main mechanism over and over is that, it can also feel like the script needs a crisis because there isn't quite enough else going on to move the relationship forward. In the book, it lands a bit differently. You can spend 50 pages inside a character's head and feel profoundly close to them without anything dramatic happening on the page. And I love slower stories, so I'm not trying to say this shouldn't have been a slow story, but on screen, you don't have that luxury. And I understand completely that with a limited budget, keeping the action mostly in one location is the right, sensible, pragmatic production choice. Absolutely. But I think even a couple of secondary storylines, a parallel romance in the household, more of a mystery about the hero's past that unfolds gradually, some genuine, community around the central couple would have given the show somewhere else to breathe. That, for me, is the bit that didn't fully click. Not the budget, not the actors, not the location, a bit of the story structure. One of the biggest points I try to hammer home is that slow pacing should never mean a lack of depth. I'm a firm believer that you can have a sweet, small-scale story without it feeling cheesy or historically hollow. My main struggle with Seeking Persephone is that it occasionally slips into that American, British prince in a castle vibe. There's a tendency in some American-authored Regency romances to hyper-focus on kind of the aristocracy and oh my gosh, they own a castle and he's a duke or a prince and he lives in this big foreboding place and how exciting is that, without actually showing the huge ecosystem that made it work, like the actual inner workings of an estate, because it was not just a castle sitting on a hill. In this story, everything stays within the castle walls, which doesn't show the massive, complex ecosystem that it actually would have been, and the real responsibility that a character like Adam would have had to own it. I've got to be honest with you guys, I'm starting to get the ick for idle male characters in period dramas. The last season of Bridgerton really showed this, and I talked about it in one of my videos, where Colin or Benedict seem to have zero day-to-day responsibilities, even though both of them are second sons and most likely would have had to work. In reality, second sons had to go into the law or the church, or military, or trade to survive. For the upper class, not having to work for a living was a sign of privilege, and I feel like that this general knowledge that the upper class didn't have to work in a traditional sense means that what we see on screen is them sipping tea and talking in front of a fireplace. And I do not understand it. Like, the upper class would have been the people who would have had the most going on. A responsible estate owner felt the weight of keeping local families employed, maintaining farms, updating housing, and managing industries like mines or quarries or mills. And I know a lot of them also had estate managers to deal with this stuff, but they would have been heavily involved. A lot of these estate owners were also entitled, and there was exploitation going on as well. And I am not agreeing with the system that used to be set up, but most of them also felt like it was their divine responsibility to stand up and be very involved, whether that's with politics, whether that's with like roads being built on their land, ports, like I could go on and on. These estate owners owned so much of the land across the UK that they had to be involved in a ton of different industries a lot of times. And so this idea that this character would just be sitting around in his castle all day and kind of like being annoyed and doing nothing just because he's in the upper classes, it gives me the ick. Like, this man needs to have more to do than occasionally ride on his land once a day. I do think Bridgerton did a halfway decent job with George in Queen Charlotte. He was also a very reclusive character for, similar reasons, where he was worried about what the outside world would think of him. But his obsession with farming and irrigation systems gave him depth. It showed he had a connection to his land and his staff. When a character like Adam in Seeking Persephone has limited interests regarding his own estate, it comes across as a bit lame to me. There is nothing attractive about him spending the majority of his time in the castle. And I understand you got to have proximity with this couple, but there could have been some sort of interest that the two of them shared that connected them, some secondary storyline to do with the estate that he brings her into his world. Don't come for me saying, this doesn't have a Downton Abbey budget. I know. I totally get that. It's meant to be a sweet, slower paced, small scale indie production, but adding historical depth doesn't need to cost more money. It just requires a little bit of reworking with the writing. Downton Abbey succeeded because Julian Fellowes understands the deep entrenchment of the British class system, but you don't need a cast of 50 to show that. He's also done way smaller productions that show the ins and outs of some of these estates in sweeter, slower paced stories. You don't need 50 servants. You just need maybe one meaningful side story. Imagine if instead another scene of them talking in a drawing room, we saw maybe a shared project, Persephone helping Adam navigate a dispute between local tenant farmers, or showing interest in the estate's library restoration, more visibility of the staff, giving Persephone one consistent, maybe female staff member, to another woman that she can relate to a bit more, instead of being surrounded by all these men. During this time period, it was hard for staff members to be allowed to get married. So it was an isolating existence in a lot of ways, and especially for a lot of women. And so her isolation could be something that she connects on with this servant, and then she can highlight a bit of the system that is in place, where it's like, oh, you haven't seen your family who works at that other estate 10 miles down the road or whatever. I haven't seen my family either. Like, gosh, we're so isolated here. You can still have the main message of her being alone, but being able to relate to somebody. Maybe the woman's a bit older. It's a bit of a mentor situation. I just feel like there could have been something to bring a bit more depth into her days of isolation that had a bit more of a bigger message beyond just her existence. Also, maybe having a story where the land is a love language. If the estate is meant to be an extension of Adam, we need to see Persephone falling in love with the land and the responsibility of it like he would. Seeing Adam care about his land and his community, even if he wanted to isolate himself inside, would give Persephone and us a real sweet reason to fall in love with him, seeing how much he cares about that responsibility, even though he shies himself away from the people that he's meant to be serving. We gotta move past the stereotype that the upper class was just sat around doing embroidery all day. In reality, those were the people with the most varied and most exciting lives. They were traveling to health retreats, embarking on grand tours, and managing vast industrial productions. Sadly, some of them were also managing slave plantations in other places as well, and we need to acknowledge that. Shows like Gentleman Jack or Cranford show upper-class estate owners getting involved in railroads and coal pits and education without losing the heart of the story. By making the people who lived and worked on these estates more integrated into the story instead of just a butler who comes up with a letter, the world can feel way more real. Even on a budget, and even with a hero who wants to hide from the world, there are ways to show that he still cares about the weight of his divine responsibility as a titled lord and a land owner. Women as well had a lot of different types of interests that they would get involved in. And just because women had less autonomy does not mean that they didn't have hobbies and things that they enjoyed to do. So I don't know why they keep showing all of these people with all of the wealth in the world, and some of it from not great means, just sitting around and drinking tea all day. I have a hard time with being attracted to a male lead who is supposed to be, brooding and masculine. He can save her from some wolves, but he doesn't have a ton to do day to day, right? So was Seeking Persephone the show for me personally? Probably not. But these are just fun things that we can talk about in a video. As someone who is writing a Regency novel, I know my work will not be to everyone's taste, or maybe it won't even live up to my own expectations that I point out in other people's work. Creativity is hard, and the brave ones out there are the people who are putting out their work. So it's so important that these are just seen as light chats around productions. There's been a lot of conversation around Seeking Persephone. Some people are hesitant because of religious ties, while others are absolutely overjoyed that this exists because it provides a clean romance they've been craving, or because it finally adapts an author that they have loved for years. I'm not going to wade into all those waters today, but I want to talk about why I see productions like this as a glimpse into a very exciting future for film and TV in general. We're at a really weird moment in media right now. Streaming has become the default, but more and more people are getting dissatisfied with what the big productions are paying for. We're getting Toy Story 5. We're getting another live action remake of a Disney film and a Harry Potter series that looks dark, that none of us asked for. And the actual interesting niche news stories are getting harder and harder to fund or get past a first season. This is where the power shifts back to us. Whether it's YouTube emerging as a top viewed platform, or creators like Markiplier crowdfunding entire films, we're witnessing one of the biggest shifts, I think, in entertainment history. Crowdfunded media allows us to put our money where our mouth is, to give direct support if a studio makes things that we resonate with. They can be a bit brave with what they make, a niche adaptation, a book with a cult following. More authors who have never had their work adapted are finally going to see their characters on screen. For this future to actually work, though, we have to change the way we watch a bit. We've got to be a bit more generous with these indie productions than we are with $100 million Netflix series. If we tear every crowdfunded production to shreds because the lighting is a bit off in one scene or the costuming isn't 1813 perfect, we're going to kill this movement in the cradle. We've all seen mega budget dramas where the history is a bit off, but we give them a pass because they're shiny, or they have really big actors that we like. We need to extend that same grace to the smaller studios that are actually trying to give us something new. Smaller doesn't have to mean cheesy or badly made. We've seen with the success of Heated Rivalry, and now we're seeing Seeking Persephone blow up simply through the power of dedicated readers and fan edits. Ultimately, what I find so heartwarming about this is the community online. There is something beautiful about a group of people saying, this story matters to me, and then it coming together and them helping making it exist. I'm excited to see more period dramas that come out of crowdsourced media. Stories where we, as the audience, finally have a seat at the table. It means that the next great adaptation might not come from a boardroom in Hollywood, but from a Kickstarter campaign backed by people who actually love the source material. I'm rooting for the indie studios, the new authors, and the fans who are tired of waiting for the big players to catch up to what audiences actually want. One of my favorite types of scenes in a period drama is the ones where like the whole village shows up. Someone's about to lose their farm, or the local schoolhouse is being torn down, or the mill is closing. And instead of just accepting it, the community just shows up. They pull what they have, they make it work, and the thing gets saved. That can be us, the fans, the readers, the people who have been watching the same 6 BBC adaptations on rotation since 2007, showing up for the stories we want to exist. No waiting on big studios to decide, because it means the next Seeking Persephone might already be in the works right now, waiting for its village to show up. Well, that is it for me, guys. Let me know in the comments, would you back a crowdfunded period drama? And if you already have, tell me which ones, because I need the recommendations. Thanks to the channel members, I'm really excited about making new exclusive content. I think a North and South exclusive video is in the works. It's a great place to be able to talk about more obscure or older or niche period dramas. So if you're into that, then check out memberships. Thanks everyone for liking, subscribing, hyping, all the things. I'm gonna go watch Sanditon now, which I know wouldn't have gotten made past season 1 if it were not for period drama fanatics like us. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye!